My name is Josie Devereaux. I'm a large animal veterinarian from rural Louisiana, 36 years old, and up until the night this story really begins, most people in my family would have described me as the granddaughter who asked too many questions and never quite learned to leave well enough alone. I take that as a compliment. Earl taught me to. Earl Devereaux was my grandfather, my mom's dad, and the most quietly formidable man I have ever known. This is the story of what he did with $1.5 million, what he kept hidden for 42 years, and what a copper key on a braided cord finally unlocked. I was 36 years old the night my uncle shoved my grandfather out onto a wet porch in a Mississippi thunderstorm. It was a Wednesday in November, the kind of Gulf Coast rain that wraps around the house and doesn't leave until it's taken something from you. My phone lit up with a text from a woman I barely knew, a neighbor 3 doors down who'd introduced herself once at a block party and never again. "Your Grandpa Earl is sitting outside on the porch," she wrote. "Bags packed. Been there a while." I was 45 minutes away. I did it in 32. Welcome to silent revenge, quiet, true accounts about family, money, and the people who finally stop apologizing for caring too much. If you've ever sat in a parked car long after you reached your destination because a story had you by the collar, you are exactly where you belong. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and hit subscribe so you don't miss the part where everything flips. Let me take you back 7 months because the money came before the storm and you need to understand the money to understand everything else. Earl was 78 years old when he decided to sell his commercial greenhouse operation outside of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He'd built it from a single lot of seedlings 47 years earlier into something that supplied garden centers across 3 states. When the offer landed, a regional agricultural company with deep pockets and no patience, Earl took it. The number was $1.5 million clean, no conditions attached. He signed on a Thursday. And then he did the thing that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. He gave every dollar to my uncle. Not a trust. Not a structured payout. Not a payment schedule with conditions attached. He called my Uncle Glenn, transferred the funds electronically into Glenn's personal checking account, and asked for one thing back. 3 words. "Look after me." I was at Glenn's kitchen table when it happened. I remember the smell of the coffee going cold in the pot nobody was tending because everyone was too focused on a phone screen showing a wire confirmation. Glenn kept saying, "Dad, you don't have to do this." And Earl, who measured his words like a man rationing food on a long trip, looked across the table at his son and said those 3 words plain as weather. "Look after me." Glenn's wife, my Aunt Patrice, stood with her arms folded and a smile that had already measured the curtains of a new house. I was the only one who asked the obvious question. "Grandpa, why no contract? Why isn't this on paper somewhere?" Earl looked at me the way he always did when I was almost asking the right thing, a slow half-grin, patient as old wood. "Some things you write down, Josie," he said. "Some things you find out." I thought it was just the kind of thing old men say when they don't want to deal with lawyers. I filed it under charming stubbornness and moved on. I was wrong. I was wrong about almost everything that year. He folded both hands on the table and didn't say anything else. The money cleared by the following Monday. You need to know who Earl Devereaux was because the rest of this won't mean anything without that foundation. Earl was the most quietly wealthy man I have ever known, and he lived like someone who'd never seen a dollar he couldn't make last twice as long as it was supposed to. He drove a 2003 pickup truck with a cracked dashboard he'd patched with electrical tape. He wore the same 3 flannels all winter and rotated them with the discipline of a military officer. He grew most of his own food in the backyard of the small house he kept in town after selling the greenhouse property, a vegetable plot so precise it looked like someone had taken a ruler to the earth. He bought store-brand everything. He mended instead of replaced. We all figured the greenhouse was the whole of his net worth. That $1.5 million was Earl converted to cash, a full life of careful work stacked in one number. He never corrected us. But every once in a while, he'd let something slip that didn't quite fit the picture we had of him. The afternoon after the wire cleared, I drove him back out to the greenhouse lot, already being assessed by the new owner's contractors, and he stood at the edge of the cleared field and stared at the bare soil like it had a voice. "People think it's just real estate," he said. "Land is never just real estate." I asked what he meant. He reached under his collar and pulled out a small copper key on a braided cord, turned it over between his fingers like a rosary, and tucked it back without a word. I made a mental note and let it go because at that particular moment in my life I was carrying my own freight. My veterinary practice, a mobile large animal clinic I'd spent 5 years building in rural Louisiana, had collapsed 10 months earlier when my business partner walked out with the client list, the second vehicle, and in a move so bold it almost deserved respect, the practice's line of credit. I was working contract shifts at other clinics, living in a 2-bedroom rental in Baton Rouge and pretending I had a 5-year plan. I didn't have a 5-year plan. I had a whiteboard and a lot of sticky notes. So when Earl talked about dirt that wasn't just dirt, I half listened the way you do when you're busy losing at your own life. He slid the key back under his flannel. We drove back to town in the April damp with the windows down. That copper key became this small game between us over the following weeks. He wore it everywhere. I asked him once, straight out, what it opened. He pinched it through his shirt and gave me that grin. "Key still opens something worth opening," he said. "That's all I'll tell a woman who just lost a whole business." Coming from anyone else, that would have stung. From Earl, it landed like something warmer. His particular way of saying he hadn't counted me out, even if I had. He moved into Glenn and Patrice's house that week. Into the back bedroom their youngest had vacated when she went off to college. For about 6 weeks it looked fine from the outside. Then the phone calls from Patrice started. "Josie, honey, has Earl said anything to you about finances? About the house?" And when I said no, her voice would go that specific kind of quiet that isn't silence at all. "Well, he gets a little confused sometimes. We're just trying to manage things properly. I know the name for that move now. It's the first play in the Elder Isolation playbook. You establish narrative control over the money conversation. You keep the inconvenient relative out of the loop. And you dress it up as concern." Patrice had grown up with real financial hardship. Her family had lost their home when she was 12, and she'd spent 25 years married into the Devereaux family. Watching Earl live frugally off land she'd always assumed was worth far less than their lifestyle deserved. When that $1.5 million landed in her husband's account, something in her decided it was compensation for those years of waiting. I didn't see the danger in those early calls. I told myself they were just stressed. Told myself caretaking was hard. I told myself that right up until November. So here we are. Back to that Wednesday night. The neighbor's text came in at 9:47 p.m. I was on a video call with a clinic in Shreveport discussing contract terms. I said I have to go mid-sentence, grabbed my keys, and drove north on I-55 with the windshield wipers on max and my hazards on because the rain was that kind of serious. When I pulled up to Glenn's house, Earl was sitting on the front porch under the single overhead light. 2 bags beside him already soaked through. And in his arms, held against his chest the way a child holds something precious, was a shortwave radio, this old, battered thing he'd had for 30 years. Antenna up. Static crackling out a weather advisory for a storm that was already on top of us. The porch light was on. Every other light in the house was off. They'd put him out and gone to bed. Glenn opened the door before I hit the steps. He'd been watching through the peephole, I think, waiting for someone to come collect the problem. "Josie, it's not what it looks like." He started. "There's a waiting list at Magnolia Gardens. We've been looking into it." Patrice appeared behind him in her robe. We set his things out front so the transport van could find him easily. "What transport van?" I said. "It's 11 o'clock at night in a thunderstorm." "He's been difficult," Patrice said, and her voice had that particular tone, reasonable, exhausted, victimized. "We've given everything. We can't keep doing this." "How long has he been outside?" Glenn looked at the floor. Patrice lifted her chin. He's not our responsibility anymore. We fulfilled our end. I looked at them for a moment, these two people standing in a warm, lit house while a 78-year-old man sat in the rain with his worldly possessions soaking through canvas, and I stopped talking. 'Cause there are some moments where words are a waste of time and action is the only language. I went back down the steps and crouched in front of my grandfather. I put my hand on the wet radio in his arms. "Hey," I said. "Let's get you out of here." He looked up at me. "And I want you to understand something." This man who had supposedly been confused and difficult for months looked at me with eyes so clear they could have cut glass. "Look after me, Josie," he said. Quiet. Not desperate. Not asking. More like handing me something he'd been holding a long time and had decided I was finally ready to carry. I got his bags. I got him into my car. As I buckled him in, the porch light behind us clicked off. We drove away from that house in the rain. If you're still with me, and I know you are, this is the moment to hit subscribe. The rest of this story goes places I didn't see coming. Stay with me. My rental was a 2-bedroom, and suddenly I was grateful for the second room. I gave Earl the bedroom with the actual bed and took the pull-out in the living room. That first night, I peeled him out of soaked clothes, found him one of my dad's old LSU sweatshirts that I'd kept for sentimental reasons, and set him up with the extra blankets while the heater rattled away. He didn't complain once. Earl never complained. He sat on the edge of the bed at midnight carefully drying that shortwave radio with a hand towel, methodically like a surgeon cleaning instruments, making sure every port and dial still worked. They all still worked. By day 2, I had restructured my entire existence around this man. I'm a vet, organization is how I express care. I built a spreadsheet, medications, blood pressure schedule, heart doctor follow-up, dietary restrictions from his stomach specialist. I shifted my contract shifts to early mornings so my afternoons belonged to him. I told myself it was temporary. Just until Glenn came to his senses. Just until things settled down. Glenn texted on day 3. Not to check on his dad. To register a position. Don't blow this up, Josie. Mom and Dad had their reasons. He's a lot to manage. He's a lot to manage. The man weighed 155 pounds, took his own blood pressure twice a day without being asked, and never once left a dish in the sink. I stared at that text for a long time. Then I looked at the line of light under Earl's closed door and listened to the low static of that radio he kept on through the night so the apartment wouldn't feel so empty. I had no real plan for how to pay for the heart doctor on contract income. I had no sense of how long temporary was going to stretch. What I knew was simpler and more stubborn than a plan. I was not sending him back. Whatever it cost me, money, sleep, my own fragile attempt at rebuilding my career, I was not sending him back. Here's the thing about people who do ugly things in private. They work twice as hard at looking good in public. Within 2 weeks, Patrice had a story and she told it to every person in our family's orbit. She told it at their church. She told it to my mom, her sister-in-law, on long Sunday phone calls. She posted vague grief content on Facebook about sacrificing everything for family and being abandoned when it gets hard. The framing was precise. She and Glenn had given years to Earl, and I had swept in and taken him to score points. My Aunt Darlene called me, her voice doing that careful, diplomatic dance. "Honey, your aunt is devastated. Why'd you take him without even calling them?" I told her exactly what had happened. The porch. The rain. The bags. The lights off. Darlene was quiet. Then she said the thing that told me which way the wind was blowing in the family. Well, Patrice exaggerates sometimes, but she wouldn't just put him out in a storm. You know how she is. People believe the version that costs them the least. I understood it. I even forgave it. But it meant I was on my own island. There was one more person I hadn't heard from yet, my cousin Marcus. Marcus is Glenn's son from a previous relationship, a year younger than me, and the one member of that branch of the family I'd always trusted to be straight with me. He drove down from Jackson on a Sunday afternoon, sat across from Earl for 40 minutes, mostly listening, and then pulled me aside in the kitchen with a look on his face I couldn't read. "How's he actually doing?" he asked. Not a fake question. A real one. I told him the truth, the fatigue, the heart numbers, the medication cost. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he said something unexpected. He asked to see me last month. Before all this, I didn't make the trip. I had stuff going on. He paused. I should have gone. There was real guilt in his face, and it wasn't the performance kind. He was the one unexpected crack in the wall, someone inside that family who hadn't made a decision yet. I filed that away. I broke down and called Glenn once. Not for me, for Earl. The new heart doctor had adjusted his medication and the updated prescription ran $280 a month, and I'd just lost a contract because I'd been short with a clinic director during a weekend that had also included a 3 a.m. pharmacy run and 4 hours of sleep. I called Glenn on a Tuesday evening, no drama, just the numbers. 3 minutes, maybe 4. Patrice answered. Course she did. I explained it flat. Medication cost. The specific dollar amount. The situation. There was a pause on the line. Then she said it in a voice so measured and reasonable it took me a full 3 seconds to feel the blade. We took on the responsibility, Josie. The money transferred. We did our part. He's your project now. Your project now. As though a 78-year-old human being was a home renovation you'd gotten tired of. I didn't argue. Arguing with Patrice was like fighting a fog bank. You'd exhaust yourself and come away holding nothing. I just said okay and hung up and stood in my kitchen with my hand flat on the counter. And that's when the full picture assembled itself in my head, clear as an X-ray. To Glenn and Patrice, that $1.5 million hadn't been a trust or a promise or a responsibility. It had been a transaction. They had accepted the money and considered Earl's account settled. The 3-word promise, look after me, had been the receipt. In their ledger, the books were closed. I went and stood in the doorway of Earl's room. He was awake, propped on the pillows, radio murmuring low. You okay, kid? He asked because somehow he was the one checking on me. Never better, I said. He didn't believe me. He let me have it anyway. What I didn't expect was that Earl would start trying to rebuild my life while I was busy stabilizing his. It started with questions. He'd watch me hunched over my laptop doing billing work for other clinics, and he'd say, "What happened to your own thing?" My own thing had been a mobile large animal clinic model with a twist. I'd been developing a low-cost GPS and vital sign tag system for livestock that could alert farmers to early illness without requiring a vet visit every time an animal ran a fever. Prototype worked. I'd just run out of runway before the market had time to notice. Complicated, I told him. Most complicated things are just expensive, he said, and most expensive things are just afraid to start over. Then he started asking technical questions. Real ones. How does the sensor communicate? What's the failure point in the field? Why is the hardware cost so high? By the end of that week, we had a notepad full of his sketches, neat, deliberate diagrams from a man who'd spent 5 decades watching animals on open land and had strong opinions about what farmers actually needed versus what engineers assumed they needed. Why are you paying for cellular data when half these farms have decent Wi-Fi in the barn now? He said, tapping one of his drawings. He was right. I'd overbuilt the communication layer. That was the first afternoon in 11 months that I'd worked on my own idea rather than someone else's. Around 4 o'clock, I looked up from the notepad and realized I'd forgotten to be sad. Earl noticed. He didn't say anything. He just refilled my water glass and kept sketching. People ask me how I managed financially through those months. The honest answer is barely. I sold my second car. I refinanced a small personal loan. I picked up a 3rd contract shift on weekends and ran on 5 hours of sleep. Some nights I ate toast for dinner and didn't notice because I was too focused on Earl's breathing through the wall or whatever diagram we'd been arguing about at the kitchen table. One afternoon he stopped me mid-sprint. I was counting his pills into the weekly organizer with my jaw clenched so tight it was giving me headaches, and he reached over and put his hand on mine. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "Carrying it so no one sees the carrying." I told him I was fine. He gave me that slow grin. "So am I," he said, which we both knew was a generous reading of his last cardiology report. And somehow, two liars at a kitchen table refusing to fall apart in front of each other, it made things a little easier to hold. Drop a comment right now with the word key if you're feeling this story. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it before the next chapter. It matters. I found the envelope on a Thursday afternoon in January. Earl had asked me to refill his pill organizer from the bag he kept in the nightstand drawer. I opened the drawer, lifted the bag, and something slid free and landed on the hardwood floor with a soft slap. A sealed envelope, heavy cream paper, with a law firm's name pressed into the corner. Elwood and Crane Estate and Trust, Gulfport, Mississippi. Paper clipped to the front was an appointment card. A date 7 days out. A time 10:30 a.m. And below it, in handwriting that wasn't Earl's, a note, "Bring the key." I sat back on my heels and held it. I didn't open it. I want you to sit with that for a second because I've sat with it 100 times myself. A woman who'd sold her car, was working 3 jobs, and could barely make the month work, found a sealed envelope from an estate attorney in her grandfather's nightstand. A grandfather who'd given away $1.5 million to people who'd put him on a porch in the rain, and she did not open it. Didn't even tempt me. Some things aren't yours to open. I clipped the card back onto the envelope and slid it into the drawer exactly where it had landed. When I looked up, Earl was watching me from the pillows. He'd been awake the whole time. His hand moved to the copper key at his collar, the way you'd reach for a thing you're finally ready to use. "You'll drive me Tuesday," he said. Not a question. "Okay," I said. I didn't ask what was in the envelope. I memorized the appointment details the same way I memorize a surgical procedure, quietly, completely, without asking for a reason. The Tuesday drive to Gulfport was 40 minutes down Highway 49 in January light, flat and silver off the coast. Earl wore a pressed shirt and his good boots. He took the copper key off from around his neck in the car and held it in his closed fist the whole walk in, the way you'd carry something irreplaceable. I offered to wait outside. He said sit. So I sat in a waiting room that smelled like strong coffee and old paper, and I waited. 57 minutes. When the inner door opened, Earl came out walking differently, straighter, lighter, like a man who'd just set down a box he'd been moving from room to room for years. The attorney who walked him out was a woman named Sandra Crane. 50s, silver hair pulled back, the kind of handshake that means exactly what it sounds like. She looked at me the way people look at someone they've already been briefed on, not surprised to see me, just confirming. "You're Josie?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, the small nod of someone checking a name off a list. Then she told Earl she'd take care of the rest and shook his hand like she meant it. In the car, Earl buckled himself in and sat looking at the windshield for a long moment. "I fixed something I should have fixed years ago," he said. "What did you fix?" He turned the copper key over once and slipped it back under his shirt. "You'll find out," he said. His whole way of looking at the world in 3 words. I started the engine and let him have the quiet and drove us back up 49 with the winter sun low over the pine flats. My cousin Glenn Jr., Glenn and Patrice's son, 29, 2 years younger than Marcus, showed up the following Saturday. I hadn't known he was coming. He brought gas station flowers and a smile with the transparency of a screen door in a hurricane. He sat with Earl for maybe 15 minutes, talked mostly about a real estate deal he was working in Biloxi, barely asked Earl a question, then followed me into the kitchen. "How's he doing?" he said. But the really was implied. I told him Earl was tired but holding steady. Glenn Jr. dropped his voice half a register. "Listen, somebody should have medical and financial power of attorney. For his protection. Family should handle it, keep it simple. Me and Mom and Dad, maybe Marcus." He manages himself fine. The smile thinned. Josie, there might be assets nobody's fully tracking. If something happens and it's not organized, he caught himself. Pulled back. I'm just saying it could get messy. Assets nobody's fully tracking. He said it plural. Not the $1.5 million, that was already settled, already in Glenn and Patrice's account. Something else. I filed that next to the copper key and the sealed envelope and the thing Earl had said about land never being just real estate. After Glenn Jr. left, I found Earl in his room. He'd heard every word through the wall. Your cousin wants my signature, he said. Nobody's getting your signature you don't want to give. He laughed low and dry. They'll get his signature. Just not the one they're after. He reached over and turned his radio up slightly. There's weather on the long-range band, he said. Something big coming up from the Gulf. He was talking about the weather. He was also not talking about the weather. The last fully good evening we had was a Sunday in February. He felt strong that day, ate a real dinner, sat up at the kitchen table while I looked at component costs for the livestock tag prototype. The radio played an old blues station out of New Orleans, low enough to be furniture. He watched my hands work for a while. Then he said the thing he'd been saving. You never once asked me what was in it for you, he said. Your uncle, the day of the wire. First question out of his mouth after I left the room was how long before he could move the money to a different account. Your aunt's first question was whether the house would sell faster in spring or summer. He turned his mug slowly on the table. Glenn Jr. last week. First and only question was about power of attorney. He looked at me. You've had me 3 months. You sold your car. You haven't asked once. There's nothing to ask about, I said. You're my grandfather. He shook his head slowly. That's the whole thing, Josie. That right there is the entire thing. I didn't know what to say. So I said the true thing, the small one. I didn't take you in for a reason. I took you in because it was you. He was quiet a long moment. You did look after me, he said. Past tense. Like he was closing a book he'd been reading a long time and putting it back on a shelf. I made some joke about how the job wasn't done yet and he'd better eat his greens. He let me have it. But something had settled in him, a stillness I mistook for peace and only later understood was the particular quiet of a man who had arrived at the place he was trying to reach. He went to bed early. I turned the radio down, not off, never off, and at the door he said, "Good night, Josie." I said, "Good night, Grandpa." Those were the last ordinary words. He didn't wake up on a Monday morning. I knew before I opened the door. You know the way a house knows it's empty the second you walk in. The quality of the silence is different, heavier, like the air has settled. He'd gone in his sleep sometime in the early hours. The radio was still murmuring on the nightstand. His mug was upside down on the drying rack, rinsed clean. He had washed his own mug. 78 years old, 3 months out from a porch in a thunderstorm, and the last thing he did before he went to sleep for the last time was rinse his cup so I wouldn't have to find it dirty in the morning. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time. The radio talked about a high-pressure system moving in over the Gulf, clearing skies by afternoon. I reached over and turned it off and the apartment went so quiet it was a physical thing. So I turned it back on. Then I did what you do. I called the doctor. Called the funeral home. And because they were his family and decency doesn't expire even when people do things that should revoke it, I called Glenn. Patrice answered. "Mom," I said, "I still called her that out of years of habit." Grandpa Earl passed last night. A silence. And then, "And I will carry this until I'm in the ground myself." The first sound out of her mouth was not grief. It was a question. Quick and bright and reaching forward like a hand. Oh, Josie, has anyone called the lawyer yet? Has anyone called the lawyer? Her dad-in-law was not yet 4 hours gone and her first thought was the estate. I told her I had to go. Then I made a cup of coffee in Earl's chipped mug and I sat at the kitchen table and I let it go cold. just to know what it felt like to do the thing he'd never done. The funeral was its own performance. Patrice wore charcoal and wept in waves at the front of the chapel, accepting comfort from every extended family member who came within arm's reach. We gave everything for him, she told the receiving line again and again. We did everything we could. In the end, he just wanted to be close to family. People held her hands. People nodded. Marcus was there, standing slightly apart from his dad Glenn, and twice I caught him watching Patrice with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself, the particular look of someone whose memory of events doesn't match the story being told out loud. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod. Not a smile. Just an acknowledgement. Glenn Jr. gave a eulogy about hard work that was, in practice, a 7-minute monologue about Glenn Jr. My uncle Glenn sat in the front pew with his hands between his knees and his eyes on the floor, and twice I saw him glance at the casket and then look away fast, like a man who couldn't bear the cost of being seen looking. After the service, as the crowd thinned to hugs and parking lot conversations, a woman in a navy blazer came up the aisle toward me. Sandra Crane, the attorney. She offered her condolences, plain, real, brief. Then she handed me a card with a date on the back. Reading of the will. 12 days out. My office. Earl asked that everyone be present. Everyone. She glanced once toward Patrice, still holding court near the exit, then back to me. And she gave me the smallest nod, private, precise, the nod of someone who has read a document and is watching the world catch up to it. The 12 days before the reading were their own weather system. Patrice's story hardened into family fact during that time. I'd manipulated a confused old man. I'd isolated him. I was after the estate. The irony of those accusations, coming from the woman whose first words upon hearing of her dead-in-law's death had been about the lawyer, could have powered the Gulf Coast. Marcus called me on date. He opened with, "I've been thinking about what he asked to see me about back in October. Trip I didn't make." Long pause. I think I understand now what he was trying to tell me. He didn't elaborate and I didn't push. But he said something before he hung up that mattered. Whatever happens in that office, I'll be straight with you after. That was the thing that kept me from feeling entirely alone during those 12 days. The morning of the reading, I did something that probably sounds strange for a scientifically minded veterinarian. I put Earl's shortwave radio on the passenger seat of my car and buckled it in. I know. I understand that a radio doesn't carry a soul. But I'd driven him to Sandra Crane's office once with that radio crackling in the seat between us, and I wasn't about to make the last drive with the seat empty. So the radio rode shotgun, antenna up, reading out a severe storm watch for the entire southern tier, the system Earl had flagged on the long-range band weeks earlier, finally arriving. Copper key was in my coat pocket, wrapped in a small paper with his neat handwriting. "Give this to Sandra." I parked outside her building as the first drops hit the windshield. Glenn's new Suburban was already there. Patrice's sedan. Glenn Jr.'s truck. And Marcus's beat-up Camry, the one he'd driven since college. He was standing outside it, hands in his jacket, waiting. He walked toward me as I got out. "Ready?" he said. "Not even slightly," I said. He almost smiled. "Same." We went in together. Conference room smelled like rain and toner. My Uncle Glenn sat across from me, hands flat on the table, looking at the surface. Patrice sat beside him, ankles crossed, chin up, wearing the face of a woman about to be affirmed. Glenn Jr. bounced his knee. Marcus sat beside me, very still. Patrice couldn't help herself. While we waited, she leaned toward Glenn just loud enough for the room. "There's not much to read, is there? He gave it all to us already. The rest is just odds and ends." Glenn Jr. laughed softly. "Probably the truck and that old radio." He'd seen me carry the radio in from the car. I'd set it on the credenza. Let me tell you what they believed walking into that room. They believed the $1.5 million had been the whole of Earl Devereaux. They believed they already had the money, free and clear, the transaction complete. They believed today was paperwork. A short reading of a frugal old man's while leaving a few sentimental items to whoever wanted them. The only open question in their minds was whether I'd make a scene. They had absolutely no idea. They'd spent years standing on something they called nothing. The inner door opened. Sandra Crane stood there in her navy suit with a leather binder under one arm and propped beside her a long gray metal lockbox, the kind with a keyhole, which she carried to the credenza and set down beside the shortwave radio. Earl updated his estate documents 11 weeks ago, she said. He asked that I read everything with all of you present. He was very clear on that point. The temperature in the room changed before she'd opened the binder. 11 weeks. Patrice's smile flickered. 11 weeks put it after the porch. After the rain. After he'd moved into my two-bedroom and started asking me questions about livestock sensors and bandwidth costs. Sandra sat at the head of the table and set down the binder. Beside it, she placed a sealed cream envelope and a folded slip of paper. Before I read the document, Earl left specific instructions. She slid the folded paper across to me. He asked that you open the lockbox when I say. I opened the paper. His handwriting, Josie. Open it when Sandra asks. Key was always yours. Sandra looked around the table once, then, the key, please. I stood. Every person in that room watched me cross to the credenza, take the copper key from my pocket and fit it into the lockbox's small lock. Turned without resistance, smooth, certain, like it had been waiting. Inside was a single file folder, thick with documents, labeled in his neat hand, the land. I carried it to the table and set it in front of Sandra. Patrice's voice came out thinner than usual. What is that? Sandra opened the folder, set her reading glasses on, and looked over them at the room. This, she said, is what Earl Devereaux actually owned. She read it plainly. No theater. Which, for the people on the other side of that table, made it worse. In 1981, Sandra said, Earl Devereaux had legally separated the underground mineral rights from his greenhouse property before the greenhouse had even turned its first profit. He'd done it quietly, paid a lawyer in cash, filed it correctly, and told no one. Those mineral rights had sat untouched while the greenhouse grew. While he patched his boots. While Patrice redecorated her mental image of what she deserved. 42 years later, the mineral rights had value. Considerable value. Slow at first, then building as commercial development expanded across that particular southern Mississippi corridor. Earl had never spent a dollar of it. He'd let it grow in accounts and careful investments. He managed himself alone, telling no one, rolling his windows down in August. When he sold the greenhouse operation, Sandra said, he had sold only the surface. He'd kept everything underneath. She turned the statement around so the table could read the bottom line. The mineral rights and accumulated proceeds, valued 11 weeks ago, just over $18 million. $18 million. My Uncle Glenn made a sound like he'd stepped off a curb wrong. Patrice said that's not possible in a voice that had lost its scaffolding. Glenn Jr. put both hands over his face. Marcus, beside me, went very still. And Glenn looked not at the statement but at the folder, at the words the land in his dad's handwriting, and his face went the gray of old concrete. The land was never just real estate. I heard it in Earl's voice as clearly as if the radio on the credenza had broadcast it directly into the room. He'd told me at the empty lot. He'd told me the night our livestock tag prototype finally worked. Both times I'd half heard it, too busy losing at my own life to understand it was a fact, not a sentiment. Patrice recovered the way she always recovered, fast and forward. Fine, she said, gripping the table edge. Fine. But we have the $1.5 million. That's settled. That was his gift to Glenn. That's done. Sandra let her finish. Then she drew a single page from the file and set it flat. About that. Earl's estate plan documented the $1.5 million transfer in specific terms. He'd recorded it not as a gift, and not as payment for caregiving because no caregiving agreement had ever been signed. He had recorded it as money paid in advance against Glenn's share of the estate. An advance against inheritance, Sandra said, which means it has already been counted. Comes off the top of what Glenn was to receive. Patrice didn't understand yet. I watched her understand it in stages, the way you watch weather come in from a distance. Sandra made it simple. Under the terms Earl signed 11 weeks ago, after deducting that advance, the remainder allocated to Glenn Devereaux is, she ran her finger down the page, this amount. She turned it around. The number under Glenn's name was smaller than Glenn Jr.'s truck payment. Sandra looked up and read one line from the document in Earl's own words because he'd asked her to read it exactly. A check clearing is not the same thing as a promise kept. I watched those words break against Patrice like a wave against a pier. She'd built her entire defense on a receipt. And my grandfather, from inside a folder he'd labeled in pencil, had just informed the room that he had never accepted the receipt as payment. Then Sandra came to my section. The remaining estate, she read, after the advance to Glenn and modest specific bequests, passes in trust to Earl's granddaughter, Josephine Claire Devereaux. She named the number. I didn't absorb it immediately. I was holding onto the edge of the table and the warm copper key, still in my hand from the lockbox. Sandra picked up the cream envelope. He asked me to read this to all of you. His words at the end. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. He'd never wasted a word. To the ones who got the check, I hope it spends well. I gave it to you knowing what you'd do with it. I wanted to see what a man does when he believes the money is already his and the old man is only dead weight. Now I know. To Marcus, you called me after the fact. That still counts for something. I hope you call first next time. To Josie, you found the envelope and put it back. You never once asked what was in it for you. Not on the worst night. Not on the broke nights, of which there were many and I knew about all of them. That is the only reading of a person I have ever fully trusted. The land was never just real estate, kid. Neither were you. Look after it the way you looked after me. I didn't cry in that room. I'd promised myself I wouldn't do that in front of them, and I kept the promise the same way I'd kept the other one. But I put my hand flat on the folder, on the word land in his pencil, and I left it there. That was when Patrice detonated. She came up out of her chair with both hands on the table. She manipulated him, she said, her voice rising through its registers. A sick, confused old man 11 weeks before he died, and she got into his ear. This is undue influence, and I will contest every single word of this document. Sandra didn't blink. Capacity assessment is in the file. 2 physicians conducted the same day Earl signed. He was found fully capable. You're welcome to contest it. Patrice turned on me instead. The mask came off completely, the charcoal grief, the chapel performance, the 30 years of careful image management, all of it gone, just a furious woman staring across a conference table. After everything this family sacrificed, she said. 30 years. And you stole it with a sob story and a soldering iron. A livestock tag, I said, because I couldn't help it. Glenn Jr. had his head in his hands doing arithmetic on a number that no longer existed. Marcus was looking at his dad. And my uncle Glenn. Glenn made a sound, a small cracked sound, staring at the letter in Sandra's hand with red eyes and a working mouth. What came out was one word, Dad. Just that. His dad's name. For 1 second I thought he was going to stand up. Say something true. Break in the right direction. He looked at me. I looked back. Then Patrice said his name, sharp as a hand coming down, and Glenn closed his mouth and put his eyes back on the carpet and stayed exactly where he'd been for 30 years. Look after me. Earl had asked only one thing of only one person. And it hadn't been the one with the check. I stood up, not because I had a speech, but because I was done sitting and the calmest thing in that loud room was me, and I wanted to keep it that way. I waited until Patrice ran out of momentum. I'm not going to fight you, I said. I'm not going to contest anything or call cousins or post on social media. Grandpa already said everything that needs to be said, and he said it in writing. I picked up the folder. You had a transaction. I had a man I wasn't willing to put back out in the rain. I looked at Glenn. That's the whole difference. It's the only difference there ever was. I looked at the room one more time at my uncle in his chair, and I said the one last true thing. He washed his own mug the night he died, so I wouldn't find it dirty in the morning. Then I walked out. Here's what the money did and didn't do, because I know you want the real ending and not just the cinematic one. Glenn and Patrice kept their $1.5 million. Most of it was already spent: a kitchen renovation, a new car, a down payment on an investment property that had underperformed. The advance against inheritance meant there was nothing further coming, and the $18 million they'd expected to inherit had never been in their hands at all. They didn't contest. Sandra made quiet contact about the capacity assessments and 2 independent physicians, and the fight dissolved before it cost anyone court fees. Glenn Jr. had to face his Biloxi real estate situation without a windfall to absorb the damage. Last I heard, he was working for someone else's firm. Cousins who'd nodded along at the funeral got quiet, and Arlene called me 6 weeks later. The first thing she said was, "I'm sorry, Josie." Not an explanation, not a defense. Just those 3 words. I told her it was okay, and I meant most of it. Marcus called the same week. He said he was trying to tell me something in October and I didn't make the drive. Long pause. I'm going to have to live with that. I told him that living with it seemed like exactly what Earl would have wanted him to do, not as punishment but as instruction. Marcus laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that tracks." The version of Patrice that had run our family for 3 decades, devoted, deprived, devastated, didn't survive that conference room. You can't take back standing over your dead in-law's estate documents and calling his granddaughter a thief. The story she'd been telling didn't hold anymore because too many people had been in the room when it broke. I drove home in the storm with the radio reading out the all-clear as the cells pushed east. I sat in my parking lot until the rain tapered to nothing. And I felt the specific grief of having won something I would have traded back for one more bad cup of coffee, one more argument about circuit board costs, one more evening of 2 stubborn people refusing to fall apart in front of each other. It's been 14 months. I did what he asked. The trust funded the livestock monitoring company, the one Earl and I redesigned at my kitchen table, built around low-cost hardware and barn Wi-Fi instead of cellular data and satellite feeds. Price point that real working farms can afford. We're in 2 states now. I have 3 employees and a waiting list. Earl would have said the waiting list was a sign we'd priced it too low and we should raise it. He would have been half right, which was his average. The other thing he asked me to do was set up a fund. It's small and it's specific and it has no gala, no annual report with stock photos of smiling people. It helps families cover the real cost of keeping an aging parent or grandparent at home, rent help, prescription gaps, respite care, for the families that a cleared check arrangement left without options. We call it the Earl Fund. His shortwave radio sits on my desk in the office, still on, still reading weather into the room. Chipped mug holds my pens. Copper key hangs on a nail by the door, and some mornings I touch it on the way out, the way he used to turn it over in his fingers like a worry stone, like a compass. Key still opens something worth opening. He was right. It opened a lockbox and a number and a room full of people who couldn't argue with their own reflections anymore. But mostly it opened the part of me that had stopped believing that showing up for someone was worth anything on its own. That love without a ledger still counted. A check can clear in a single afternoon. People will tell you that settles it. That the transaction is complete, the obligation discharged, the books balanced. But keeping a promise takes your entire life. And in the end, that is the only ledger anybody reads out loud in a room that goes silent. That's my story. One stormy night, 3 words, look after me, and a will that finally made everything true in writing. If this reminded you that love is something you do and not something you wire, take it with you. Call the person who once showed up for you while you still can. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Silent Revenge.